Hello, my name is Stephen Denney. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Toronto and a columnist for the Korea's blog The Diplomat. I am joined today by colleague and comrade Dr. Adam Cathcart, lecturer of Chinese history at Leeds University and editor-chief of the research site Sino-NK.com. We're going to start today's conversation around a conspicuous absence, and then see where that takes us. North Korea's supreme leader and dictator with bad haircut, Kim Jong-un, hasn't been seen in public since September 3rd. This has fueled all sorts of speculation. He's either sick, broke his ankle, has gout, or was possibly overthrown in a coup. What is really going on we cannot say for sure, but North Korean state media did admit he is experiencing some discomfort. Dr. Cathcart discussed some of these theories floating in the ether in a recent Atlantic article. What exactly did you write about, Adam? Tell the world what they need to know.
Well, I think the difficulty in understanding Kim Jong-un's absence, Stephen, is that he was so present before, in part. And so he's built up expectations among not just us, and in a way the Western media and people like you and I don't necessarily matter so much to the North Korean state, but to the people at home. This person, Kim Jong-un, has built up quite a track record of being present at all times. A very, very extensive list of on-site inspections, and he's everywhere doing everything in Pyongyang, and sometimes even out in certain provinces. So I think his absence creates a gap in terms of kind of the state's media narrative of itself, questions of control, and is anybody paying attention to running the state, for example. It also opens up some questions about who's running things, and I wrote about those in the article, talking about some theories that are out there about other individuals. But there are many individuals, of course, who make up the North Korean state in the elite strata. So I think it's important, and the thesis basically the article ends with, after making a few points about his disappearance and why that gap is so glaring, is the point that I make is that there are other people we need to be paying attention to. Not least Hwang Pyong-so, but there are many, many others, like Kim Ki-nam, who runs propaganda, for example, and other generally senior, quite old guys that are running North Korea. So Kim Jong-un is a young and active face, and if he's gone, then maybe we're starting to look at an older North Korea.
Perhaps. You mentioned Hwang Pyong-so. Why is he important?
Well, he's a significant. Anybody who is seen with the leader so often, I think, automatically takes on a certain prominence. His profile has really risen in the last year, and of course, the reason he matters is because not so much, I believe, because of his bureaucratic status, this organization and guidance department that he's the vice chair of, but that his previous number twos have not fared well. I mean, this is the funny thing. There's all these confident pronouncements being made in various quarters about, this guy is really, he's the one. He's showing a kind of institutional arrogance. He's going to Incheon, for example, and that this shows kind of he's flaunting his power, etc. The next day he was receiving athletes back in Pyongyang. He didn't even get to spend the night in Seoul, and they were saying very flattering things about the leader, of course, in state media. But I think that he's one of many individuals, I think, who are kind of surrounding the leader. And the reason that it's so important, I think, the number two, the ostensible number two, nobody's called that, is that his predecessors were ousted. They were purged rather conspicuously. So a previous general and then Jang Sung-taek, of course, last December. So it's like being around Mao, right. The number two guy never lasts very long. So I wonder sort of how much power this guy really has.
There seems to be like a positive relationship between like proximity to the supreme leader and possibility that you'll be purged.
Well, if you overstep the boundaries, I think in particular, and I mean the Jang Sung-taek purge. And of course it's not the job of journalists to unpack all of this stuff. I think right. Partly it's for historians and taking a long view. What happened in the Jang Sung-taek purge? Why are we needing to talk about this person and what it actually meant? So there are outlets out there. There are people who are trying to figure it out with varying degrees of success and varying amounts of information. But I believe we have a lot of information actually about North Korea and about who's around the leader and what they do, and even reading their own statements sometimes, which sometimes they're put out for manipulative purposes, but other times we don't read them with any depth at our peril.
Sure. So in North Korea, it's commonly referred to as, a reclusive state. It's closed down. You can't get information about it. You don't know what's going on inside. But as you said before, and I agree, there are ways to study North Korea. There are ways to get information about what's going on inside the state, and even within like the corridors of power. Let's talk about this for a little bit. What are some of the ways that you go about learning about North Korea, studying North Korea?
Yeah. Well, I had a good conversation about this with Jang Jin-sung, who is a very well-known defector. He's recently published a book called Dear Leader, and he edits the site New Focus International. Now, he's hardly the first defector to come out and to be writing about North Korea, and the website Daily NK, of course, long predates New Focus International, and they continue to put out really good work. And you have defectors like Kang Chol-hwan, who have written books and write for Chosun Ilbo and outlets like that. So Jang isn't the only person we should be listening to of those North Korean voices, but he advised me when I met him in Leiden University at a wonderful conference that really there are three main sources. There's North Korean television, which is now more and more on YouTube. Anybody can find it. DPRK News. There are many, many sites. So North Korean television, Nodong Shinmun, which is published in 3 languages, the Workers' Daily. It's the party newspaper, and not everybody reads that in North Korea, and it's hard to get copies often, but it's very, very important for official statements. And then the KCNA, the Korean Central News Agency. There's some radio, there's music, there's movies and art, which I believe you should also be analyzing, in which I engage with the musical side of things. What messages are being sent in songs and things like that. But by and large, those are the main contemporary sources, but you have to background it and backstop it against as much reading as you can in North Korean history and in the history of the Korean Peninsula. So that's something I know you're engaged in on a daily basis, and other serious scholars as well.
I think we should not forget, too, that these elite defectors in exile themselves are new sources of information that in times past. So even not that long ago, so in the 90s, you had a very prominent defection in 1997, Hwang Jung-yeop, who kind of flew under the radar. He talked quite a lot about what was going on in North Korea, but his words didn't gain a whole lot of traction. It seems to me that at that time in history, that defectors weren't so much considered as like legitimate sources of information. Things seem to be changing now, and the Leiden conference that you referenced took place last month on the 18th, and it was called a State of Non-Legitimacy: North Korean Voices in Exile. And our fellow colleague Christopher Green has talked about here and there over the last few years that there's sort of a if I can use a wonkish word for a moment, like an epistemological shift in North Korean studies, that we can study the information, the data that is provided to us by North Koreans themselves. So the very fact that you were talking to Jang Jin-sung about how to know North Korea and about what's going on in North Korea, I think speaks volumes to the shifts within the North Korean sort of area studies discipline and other disciplines as well. Would you agree with that?
Well, absolutely, I would agree with that. And you can see government leaders more and more meeting with defectors. Of course, the most famous recent example prior to Jang Jin-sung's book, the Escape from Camp 14, the Shin Dong-hyuk, and he drives the North Korean ambassadors and diplomats crazy because they want to say that his whole story is made up, etc. But, he's met George W. Bush at the time when George W. Bush was in office, Nick Clegg, who is certainly not the most powerful person in the UK government, but when he goes to Seoul, he meets with young defectors. I mean, there's a kind of a legitimacy for the. It's not a movement. I mean, that's the funny thing. It's like Occupy Central in Hong Kong. It's not a one person movement. This isn't the civil rights led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that we like to think about in the United States. I mean, we remember it that way, but in fact, it's an extremely diverse.
Right.
Movement, made up of all kinds of strands. Some people are religious, some aren't. And so defectors themselves, and I think the conference highlighted that,
right.
Believe a lot of different things. And there's a lot of people are hearing different things. And I think that's good, the kind of diversity that the North Koreans themselves bring. And thanks to, active work by people like Chris Green and Shirley Lee and these kind of translators who are, helping to translate the North Korean voices in texts so that the rest of us can actually have something new to debate. And we're not just in an echo chamber. I think it's a very, very healthy thing,
right.
And needs to be encouraged.
So there's voice, right? But it's important to recognize that there is a plurality of voices, and not every North Korean defector thinks alike. Like even
Very
amongst
much.
the elite defectors who were at the recent Leiden conference, not all of them agreed on what was going on in North Korea in regards to the OGD. This is the notion that's put forth by Jung and his associates at New Focus, that the Organization and Guidance Department is actually the locus of power in North Korea, and that Kim Jong-un is merely a puppet, is one opinion amongst many. That all the elite defectors at the conference didn't agree with that line.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's
my main. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean that there's a massive amount of diversity, and that it takes time to pick it apart.
Sure.
And I think that's what going to Seoul is for. That's what bringing people to Europe and to the U.S. and to Canada is for. And obviously the internet has changed, right? I think the discourse around North Korea, because there's many more people involved and more people engaged, and it's easier to have a voice and for people to get access to your voice. And I think that's good, so that North Koreans themselves have agency in the whole process.
Absolutely. So Adam, you're a historian, and to keep the focus on the North Korean elite for a moment more. In another piece you published recently, you argued that North Korean leaders have been purging their ranks since essentially the beginning of time, since the beginning of the movement itself, right? What reason do you have to believe that there won't be another major purge in North Korean elite circles, or is another purge on the horizon?
Stephen, I don't know why you would ask that question. I think North Korea is a very, very stable place where nothing like that would ever happen. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. That's a great question, and that's the beauty, I think, of what I'm doing on a daily basis. And it's not beautiful work that I'm producing, but it's a really, really fun thing to study. I'd recommend it to anybody. Studying the history of North Korea and North Korea's relations with China, kind of what happened in the Korean War, the foundations of the state, which largely reside in Manchuria. I mean, this is the thing. To study North Korea, I think you also have to go to Manchuria. You have to go to this kind of promised land of revolution. It's
right.
Quite this massive site of imagination for the North Korean state. So, when you go back to that level, to kind of at the structural, historical level, people like Bruce Cummings at the University of Chicago and Adrian Buzo and other scholars, whose work deserves building on, frankly, would argue that this is a state, right? There's the Kim Jong-un and there's the Kim family, and they're very unique and kind of very unusual individuals in a way, but they represent a much bigger government. They represent kind of an impetus, a direction, a kind of a thrust in terms of not just myth, but what they've learned from history. And so we ignore what they've learned in the Korean War at their peril. We ignore how they've purged colleagues in the past at our peril. I mean, the notion that a North Korean leader would be out representing the DPRK on the world stage, and then a few months later would have a show trial against them. This happened in 1953.
Right.
You had the foreign minister, Park Han-young of North Korea, the DPRK, who had been repping the state since its inception.
Right.
Who, after working with Kim Il-sung for 5 years, is suddenly public enemy number one.
Right.
Show trial, he's gone. So there's other debates that need to be had. It's not. I think the OGD obsession that's out there, it's great, feast away, but analyze, don't just repeat, and also recognize there are other models out there. And this notion of kind of, is it a Stalinist state? I mean, you've done a lot of writing about this too. This kind of, what type of state is North Korea? Is it Stalinist? Is it a sultanate? This kind of
right.
All these kind of debates, because the way that they purge and the way that they run things, I think that's coming back to it. So I think the purge is very, very possible still.
Definitely.
But it's as part of a pattern, and there would be, there's certain predictability of this of the system, I suppose.
Yeah, it's important, the mode of government, the type of, the way in which they conduct their administrative tasks will tell us a whole lot about how the state runs. And I think from that we can learn what kind of state it is. And you referenced regime types. And sort of in the literature that I engage with, you have like 3 basic regime types. You have a party regime, you have a military regime, and you have a personalist regime. And of course, these are ideal types in like the Weberian sense of the word. And you can have hybrids. And to understand that means to like have a deep appreciation of North Korea, to do deep readings, to tease out like the broader structural conditions and sort of these historical continuities. I think it's quite easy. not quite easy, but it's instructive, and it will tell you that North Korea was founded as a revolutionary party state, and to this day, 2014, it continues to act like a revolutionary party state. That'll tell you a whole lot about how to understand North Korea. So that way you get away from like this navel gazing, right? And reading the tea leaves, and you have a deeper appreciation of the foundations of the state and how these particular modes of governance are reproduced over time, right?
Well, and I absolutely, and I think that I spend more time on the Chinese-North Korean border than the Turkish-Syrian border, although that's a fascinating place to be for journalists if they can stay safe. But I think that thinking about the Syrian model, the Ba'athist Party, and kind of this hereditary dictatorship, I think the North Koreans are looking at Syria very closely.
Absolutely,
and this kind of that's obviously a very, very negative scenario for the DPRK. I did want to respond really quickly, though, to one thing that you said. When you talk about types, and I'm almost disagreeing with myself, too, about, deep structures, you got to go back to the roots. And Bruce Cummings, of course, would argue that it's a guerrilla state, right? If you don't understand the Manchurian guerrilla movement and factionalism in the 1930s, get it. You're not going to understand how truly paranoid is kind of seen as a negative word, but let's call it positive. You better be paranoid if you're running a state from Pyongyang that's half the Korean Peninsula with 23 million people, with all the resources, both advantages and disadvantages you have. So, but at the same time, I think you have to recognize sometimes the history is totally misused. That sometimes what they say in state media, doing deep readings. I mean, you do a deep reading of a Nodung Shimun editorial. You're really translating the Korean or the Chinese version. You're retranslating. You're finding stuff that isn't in the English version, and at the end of the day, that's great, but maybe it's all just fluff, and it's smoke and smog and mirrors, as some people would say. It's a theater state. So you've got to read it, but it's separating the kind of as Chairman Mao used to say, the real bullets from just the cannon smoke. That's what he told Nixon. He said, "We have to continue to curse you. Don't." When they met in 1972, those are just empty cannon shots. Don't mind them. And maybe that's what we saw when the North Koreans came to Incheon, last week, right? I mean, the party paper was still cursing Park Geun-hye, the South Korean president, literally on the papers that were printed the night before. And these guys show up in Incheon and are smiling and shaking hands while they're, presumably the press is complaining. Not just the press, but the National Defense Commission. I mean, a very, very powerful institution. Everybody talks about the OGD, but the NDC, or the National Defense Commission, is really vital as well, and Huang's on that too, and they were cursing Park Geun-hye. So maybe it's all just hot air,
or it's for show. There was a recent Daily NK article yesterday, perhaps, which claims to have received information which proves that the trip to Incheon from North Korea was all for internal consumption within North Korea itself. So they went there to celebrate the end of the Asian Games, to attend the closing ceremonies, to venerate North Korean athletes who are performing, for the state. They represent the state, and then they go back. And this is for people to consume, and it shores up the legitimacy of a theater state, right? So I think there seems to be, some incongruity between the fact that two high-ranking officials are in Seoul, which seems to indicate to some people, at least, that North Korea may be interested in improving relations, or hell, maybe even rapprochement. When in fact, others look at this and say, no, don't you understand the internal logic of the North Korean regime itself, of a theater state? This is all, it's for show. So, athletic performances are for show.
Yeah. I have a comment and a question on that, Stephen. And that is, the comment is, I recently met with some South Korean officials and asked them their take. What's your idea about this recent visit? And it was amazing. I thought I thought I was going to hear something about reunification. Maybe it can happen. We're going to listen to them very clearly, and because definitely this is the one time in the last few years anyway that you feel like North Korea's really opened up its hand, more or less, to say, we're here, let's talk. I mean, it was in some ways, very simple. But their view was basically, they didn't really say anything. These guys didn't put any concrete proposals on the table. They didn't have a letter from Kim Jong-un. There was just some kind of a verbal statement. They met the unification minister. And we're still kind of mad about 2010 when they blew up our ship. and bombed the island in November 2010 of Yongpyong Island. So the North Koreans have ground to make up, and there's a huge agenda between the two Koreas. It's unending. The Kaesong Industrial Complex, the family reunions, Hyundai, one wing of this massive corporation, setting up tourism trips to Mount Kumgang. So there is some interpenetration of the demilitarized zone and of the border between the two Koreas, but that agenda is massive, and the South Korean officials I spoke to were basically, okay, well, let's see what they put on the table when we're having a proper meeting. And I thought that kind of guarded skepticism is quite, it's quite apropos. I think it tells you something about the guarded realism that the South Koreans have. But my question for you is, you're the expert on inter-Korean relations and on South Korean domestic politics, nationalism. You have a lot of data that's quite unique on kind of how South Koreans are feeling about not just North Korea, but their own national identity. Mm. I wanted to ask you about the political swings in South Korea and how the North Korea issue plays, because I know the sort of moderate right-wing party, Saenuri, is obviously in control of things. But could you talk a little bit about how the inter-Korean relations play out in the South Korean domestic political landscape?
Well, there's an old theory, it's called the northern winds. And it's the notion that, I guess the logic or the impact that it allegedly had goes something like this. So by North Koreans engaging in a provocation, such as the type of provocation that we saw about 12 hours ago, when a ship crosses the northern limit line and engages in an open combat with a North Korean vessel or a South Korean vessel. Such acts will actually serve to strengthen the hardliner approaches within South Korea itself, which is then used to sort of generate legitimacy in the North. So it's a sort of dynamic between the North and the South about how the South Korean Republic will react to a provocation by North Korea and the domestic reverberations that has. It's a bit. There's no real good data to support this theory, as far as I know, and I wouldn't be willing to speak of it as like an authoritative approach to understanding like North-South relations and the domestic impact of North Korean provocations. But there are some trends that are starting to show themselves within sort of the public opinion data. Some of the data that I've been able to get my hands on. Some of the things that I've been working with Carl Friedhoff from the Asan Institute, which does a great job at generating a lot of good public opinion data. And what you see is basically, if I could sort of summarize, South Korean, the population, the electorate, has taken sort of a general right turn. That on security issues, national security issues, they're realists. They're not going to be duped. They're not going to be fooled. They look at North Korea and they say it partakes in deviant behavior, and they sort of have a consistent response to the deviant behavior, to provocations and the like. And they simply want the South Korean government to respond as all states would that are seeking to protect, the sovereign integrity of the country. Additionally, and this one's a bit interesting. Whereas in times past, North Korea has sort of been seen by those in South Korea or the North Korean people have been seen by the South Korean people as belonging to the same nation. Like we are part of the same, what in Korean is the minjo, like the race, the blood, the nation. But nowadays, you're seeing a shift in the perceptions of what makes one Korean, such that blood is far less important, and things like civicness are becoming much more sort of those, like I guess, civic traits of nationalism are becoming those traits which are seen as qualifying one as Korean, especially amongst the South Korean youth. And with that, you have like this shift from an understanding of one nation, two states to two nations, two states. So I think if you take these two developments together, you're seeing basically the development of two independent nation states. So both independent nations and independent states.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to notice for going forward in prospects for unification and the like.
I think it's always a little dangerous to engage in off the top of the head sort of comparison, but it makes me think of Hong Kong. It's sort of like people in Hong Kong are supposed to be Chinese. I was there earlier last month rather, in September. And there was a great piece in the New York Times recently, and it really crystallized a lot of things that I felt like I had observed and people I had talked with. And it was sort of, we're ethnically Chinese, but we're not a part of this PRC. We don't want to be a part of this nation. And obviously Hong Kong is much, it's economically dynamic, but mainland China is nothing to sniff at. So I think, of course, in the inter-Korean relationship, you have this problem of unification pending, perhaps, and major economic inequalities. So I'm going to keep my eye on the Hong Kong thing and think about this kind of one country, two systems idea. But that two states, two nations is really absolutely fascinating. I thought, Stephen, that when you talk about nationalism, and I brought up China now, so the cat's out of the bag, right? We've got to deal with this powerhouse. There was a great article, great in the sense of sort of peels your eyebrows up in the Times, the London Times today, which was about basically Kim Jong-un's disappearance, and what was the author's take on it? His take was that Kim Jong-un was basically in bed with the military, and that's why the North Koreans were so hard-line. And it's up to the Chinese to basically put their foot down and put North Korea in its place. And I think that's something that there ought to be a little pushback about. You spent some time in China recently on a grant and sort of plugging around the Northeast. And I don't know if we can talk about China a little bit, because that's an area that I'm very curious about, because I think on the one hand, they do have a lot of leverage with North Korea. When you have a major newspaper in Britain saying, and this is not some tabloid, I mean, this is the Times of London, saying, China's got to put its foot down and end the crisis on its border with North Korea. And it's like, well, if they put their foot down, there would be a crisis on the border. I wonder if we can maybe unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it. So the Sino-DPRK relations have been characterized as close as lips and teeth, right? This goes back a long way to a brotherhood cemented in blood in the 1950s, the early 1950s, during the Korean War, and you've had this close brotherly relationship for since then. In what ways has that sort of close friendship reproduced itself over time? And do you today still see the sort of close relationship that you once had during the Cold War era? That would be my question to you. I traverse China. I'm interested in it. As you said, if you're interested in the Korean Peninsula, you have to be interested in Manchuria, and Manchuria happens to be in China. So you are by proxy interested in China if you do Korea. But you're the Chinese historian. You lecture in Chinese history at Leeds University. What do you think about this?
Well, I'm glad you used that word, which was reproduce. The relationship, the good relationship between this comradely relationship between North Korea and China. And what that means really is the relationship party to party, right? The Korean Workers' Party with the Chinese Communist Party. Basically, their structures are very, very similar. Although China's National Defense Commission is not, doesn't have quite the same twist to it that it does in the DPRK, but basically they're very, very similar, origins, and institutionally speaking and culturally speaking, in terms of anti-Japanese resistance and even interpersonal ties. I mean, some of the work that I've done with a scholar in Washington, D.C. called Chuck Krause, who works at the North Korea International Documentation Project, which I highly recommend to anybody. I think that's, if you want to go to the next level of North Korean studies, if you've kind of been reading, you're sort of interested, you're reading a lot of news, do some deep diving into these tons of sources they've got. You can actually come up with some original stuff yourself, because not everybody's reading it online, the North Korea International Documentation Project. But anyway, the point being that I'm glad you said reproduce, because the relationship has, in so many ways, perpetuated itself up until now. I mean, the fact that we're only in the last, 8 to 9 years really debating oh, maybe China's really mad at North Korea. Maybe this is some kind of breaking point. I mean, this is sort of like talking about reform at the Vatican, right? I mean, it's often quite glacial, and then all of a sudden you realize you're talking about something that, might have come out completely differently or might have changed a long time ago. So I think that that historical relationship is important to discuss because it's still reproducing itself in many ways. There's a trade fair in Dandong in about a week on October, I think it's 14th, something like that, 14th to the 18th or 16th through the 20th. Anyway, in Dandong, and that's kind of it all grows out of this old time relationship. And they'll send performing delegations. And which orchestra plays in Dandong, I think, actually matters quite a bit. These signals. The North Korean ambassador in Beijing, might get invited to a special concert and rub elbows with, members of the Politburo or the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that reproduction thing, we kind of ignore that, again, at our peril, but because it's happening. But at the same time, lots of change, lots of controversy, and lots of what I would call is kind of barely disguised anger between both parties.
There are ways that this relationship is tested. One of them is the North Korean hijacking of Chinese fishing vessels. This has happened for 3 consecutive years, 2012, 2013, and again this year. You've written a little bit about this. Can you speak to how does China deal with this? It's like it really, I think it highlights the fact that North Korea in so many ways is the thorn in China's side. And you have these incidents that sort of some people might think threaten to sort of to unrail a close relationship. What's your read on the situation?
Well, I mean, I've done more translating about it than sort of analysis, and I think reading what China actually says in Chinese about it, it's actually kind of shocking. I mean, sort of how explicit it is that our people are getting beat up. These guys, these basically North Korean soldiers, get on our ships, hijack them, bring these guys to some little island and beat them or threaten to beat them until they write a confession. So all this humiliation that Americans feel or ought to feel, frankly, when they see someone like Matthew Miller, a young American tourist, being paraded around a North Korean courtroom and having to sign confessions and things like that. I mean, Chinese know what that's about now because these fishermen come home and they're bruised and they're interviewed by the central news media or by, the Dalian newspaper or something that goes viral. And so I think that there's that. But this whole thing about North Korea being a thorn in their side in the sense of maritime problems. I mean, China has a lot of thorns, right, all over the Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and that's the problem for North Korea. It's not that, well, this is going to destroy the unique Chinese-North Korean relationship. It's that, what if North Korea starts getting looked at by Beijing just like everybody else in Southeast Asia? And you see netizens say that. You'll see little commentary like, oh, don't let North Korea become Vietnam. And China had to invade Vietnam, or they thought they had to, so they did. In 1979, I mean, that was one of the first things Deng Xiaoping did, to go try to beat down these, recalcitrant and obdurate, North Vietnamese communists.
So despite the tension between China and North Korea, business goes on as usual. You gave a talk at KEI over the summer about special economic zones and cross-border business. There are 2 sort of entry points into China from North Korea, right? There is the entry into Dandong via Siniju, and then there's the entry to the Hunchun Yenji area from up in the northeast. Would you talk a little bit about sort of the business ties and the business activity that takes place in these 2 regions?
Yeah. Well, I think as you say accurately, Stephen, there are 2 main anchor points, and the most important by far is the one between the northeast Chinese city of Dandong, which is kind of a small border town that's grown massively in the last 10 years on the Yalu River, in the estuary of the Yalu River, flowing out into the Yellow Sea, and Xinhuiju, which is a pretty big, by North Korean standards, city on the northwestern the North Pyongyang province, so it's on their northwestern frontier, and that's where most of the Sino-North Korean trade comes through. So it's a really important site, and they've built a new bridge, for example. It's not functional yet, but it's very close. And then, of course, the Yenji kind of Chinese-Korean region, which is landlocked, and they really want access to the sea up there. further up in north and east of Manchuria, close, very on the cusp of the Sea of Japan. So there's kind of a geographical necessity driving that particular relationship where China wants access to the warm water port. It's the sort of northernmost warm water port on the Pacific landmass, I suppose. So these kind of economic connections between the two states continue. In the interior, there are a few border points which are kind of, they're not really heating up, but you hear about them a lot because of, drug running and, the Daily NK, I think, has some sources up there in cities like Changbai across from Haesan. And, a lot of these North Korean defectors do end up in those kind of places. So we don't want to totally forget that there's something going on. And there's even North Korean Chinese tourism now going on in these kind of interior areas, like between Jian and Kangye and things like that. So we don't want to totally ignore that. But yeah, it's mainly anchored on the ends of the Korean border. And that's not a mistake by the North Korean government, because part of their strategy with special economic zones and trade in general has been this kind of mosquito net strategy, right? You kind of keep it as far away from Pyongyang as possible. And they're bringing in really a lot of consumer goods from China. So that line between Sinŭiju and Pyongyang is extremely important and is heavily guarded. And, that's where you get these North Koreans coming in with massive amounts of goods from China. And then also in the northeast, there's a lot of manufacturing that goes on in this northeastern special economic zones up there. And the city of Hunchun is another one in China, where when I was there last month, there was it's great to get paper. I love paper because you can pick it up and you're not finding the stuff online. Just get a few back issues of Yanbian Chunbao, these kind of Yanbian newspapers, and you find trade is way up in that area. It's up like 67% in the last 6 months. So it was kind of depressed after the Jiangsu tech purge, but it's back with a vengeance. And now they're even trading in rubles and South Korean won, and there's more South Korean money, and Yenji's really picked up. It's Isaac Stone Fish, who's a great journalist, went up there in 2010, and he used words like, I think it was something like, kind of like Stalinist, and it was kind of a depressing place. And in the winter, I think Yenji a few years ago was pretty depressing, but it's really picked up just in the last few years. A lot of nice coffee shops, kind of upscale stuff, more South Korean students. And it's by no means Shanghai, and it never will be, but it's not bad. So there's a lot of money to be made along the frontier, and you can meet North Korean business people coming in and out, and some who are in China for longer periods of time, like waitresses who are there to, basically do karaoke and make as much money as possible and bring it back home to the state, not their families.
Right. I think though, despite the increase in economic activity, perhaps growth in Yenji, Dandong is by far more popular. There's significantly more economic activity taking place there. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the figures are tough to get. I mean, people like Stefan Haggard at the University of California, San Diego they're always trying to get their hands on this data. And I think there's more and more data coming out, but you're basically dependent on Chinese statistics because the North Koreans, I spoke to someone who teaches at a North Korean university, a foreign scholar, and he said their grasp of statistics. It's not that they're poorly educated or that they can't grasp it, but you can't get Microsoft Excel a lot of times, as Felix Abt, the businessman, will remind you time and time again. And the study of statistics as a discipline is actually quite poor in North Korea. So they're not even, that's the other thing. Are they transparent because they're trying? Are they opaque rather because they hate transparency, or just because they don't have the data? And so we have very little trade data from the DPRK itself. And we have to get a lot from South Korea in terms of inter-Korean trade, which does happen. But Chinese-North Korean trade is mainly, you get information from the Ministry of Commerce and from these provincial outlets and things like the Yanbian newspaper, like I said. So it's, but absolutely, it's the main trade runs through Dandong, and so it's a very vital and a growing and an important city in this trade node. But does it create this impetus for change? And that's, I think, where the special economic zone argument often falls flat, right? Because we have China in mind. And why can't North Korea be more like China? Why can't these special economic zones take off? Why doesn't the central government really support them? Why don't they create different laws? Is it easier why can't foreigners come in and out? Why can't foreigners have access to cell phones? Why can't North Koreans have access to, international internet networks, for example, the internet with capital T, capital I, right? So, why don't they experiment with things like that in special economic zones? And my understanding is that it's very, that's so nascent. I think Rason is, the Northeastern Economic Zone is so peripheral and still quite heavily controlled. So it's one thing to make money and have Chinese businessmen coming in and out and to be manufacturing little motorbikes, and it's good for their economy, but they've got this kind of corrupt court economy. There's a huge amount of there are these sort of oligarchs within the system, and some people argue that's what purges are about. It's so Huang Byung-so, to come back to this old guy, if he tries to take a bite out of somebody's light industry, or suddenly wants to control the coal outputs, right? There's a lot of money to be made there, and then you have a fight. So that's the kind of thing now that can create purges and problems within. But it's not about sort of systemic reform, and that they're going to experiment with, to come back to Hong Kong, create a North Korean Hong Kong, and then everything spreads and everybody's in love with circulation of foreign currency and foreign ideas suddenly in the DPRK.
Right. I think if there are two lessons that you can take away from a study of Sino-NK cross-border business activity, it is one, that China is not about to shut off the tap, right? And two, that things are as they were before, or as they always have been more or less in North Korea. That it's not precipitating, massive reforms, economic, social, or otherwise.
Yeah, I should engrave that somewhere. Yeah, about North Korea, things are as they have been, more or less. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this.
But there are small changes, right? Like it would be wrong to say that things are static.
Let me give you a good example, Stephen, to come back to where we began this conversation. Kim Jong-un disappears for a month, right? A full month. He's not there. And there are documentaries put out. James Pearson at Reuters, basically spotted this documentary that said he's in pain, right? He's in discomfort. And the crazy thing is that the state media output hardly changes at all. And they just keep cranking stuff out. Front page articles about what Kim Jong-il did in 1974. There was literally an article the other day about the 2-year anniversary of Kim Jong-un's commemoration of the 18-year anniversary of a speech made by Kim Jong-il. So it's so recursive. It's so, kind of poured into itself and of itself. And there's the whole cosmology of North Korea and the way that the state media works and what people are expected to discuss. It's absolutely remarkable how entrenched this has become and how little it's changed. It's like, it's not in amber, it's dynamic. They put the old wine into new bottles. This Moranbong band, the girl band, is something we should take extremely seriously because, hey, it looks like change. But in fact, they're re-upping and kind of making more sexy these very old movies made by Kim Jong-il. And so, I mean, to me, that's a story that nobody's talking about. Kim Jong-un is gone, and there's speculation about what's happening among the leadership circles. But it's also fascinating from the day-to-day standpoint of everyday North Koreans who attend political lectures, who read Rodong Shinmun, who are watching television, if they have electricity, which not all of them do regularly. But it's just like business as usual, and maybe they could do that for a whole year, and who's going to complain? It's North Korea. You don't talk back to the Rodong Shinmun, and you don't you don't throw shoes at your television set.
Right. Well, I think that is a good note to end on. I think we've discussed a multitude of issues covering Northeast Asia that should give listeners plenty of things to think about. So again, I'm Stephen Denney. This is Adam Cathcart. And in North Korea, things are as they were, more or less.